The autumn leaves were dancing outside the window of their Brooklyn brownstone when Margaret Chun heard the words that would change everything. Her son-in-law, Derek Morrison, stood in the middle of her daughter's living room, his face flushed with anger, pointing an accusatory finger at her. "Your dramatic mom ruins everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's daughter, Emily, stood frozen near the kitchen doorway, her hands still wet from washing dishes. The Sunday family dinner had gone from pleasant to poisonous in less than 5 minutes. Margaret had only suggested that Derek should listen to Emily's concerns about expanding his tech startup too quickly. Emily had mentioned her worries to Margaret in private last week, how Derek was taking enormous loans, how he barely slept anymore, how he had mortgaged their apartment without fully discussing it with her first. But Derek saw it differently. He saw interference, control, drama. "This isn't the first time," Derek continued, his voice rising. "Every decision we try to make, there you are, questioning everything. Our wedding venue, our apartment choice, my business decisions. Emily and I are adults, Margaret. We don't need you orchestrating our lives like we're characters in one of your plays." The theater reference stung. Margaret had been a drama teacher for 30 years before retiring. She had taught countless students, directed dozens of productions, and yes, she had a flair for expression. But dramatic? She had always thought of herself as passionate, engaged, present. "Derek, that's enough." Emily finally spoke, her voice shaking. "No, it's not enough," Derek shot back. "I'm tired of biting my tongue. Your mother needs to understand boundaries. This is our life, our marriage, our business, not hers." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She had raised Emily alone after her husband died when Emily was just 7 years old. She had worked double shifts, gone without vacations, postponed her own dreams to give her daughter every opportunity. When Emily met Derek 5 years ago at a tech conference, Margaret had welcomed him with open arms. She had even helped them with the down payment on their apartment when Derek's startup was just beginning. But now, standing in that living room with family photos on the walls and the smell of her homemade pot roast still lingering in the air, Margaret felt like an intruder in her own daughter's life. "I should go," Margaret said quietly, reaching for her purse. "Mom, wait," Emily started, but Derek interrupted. "Yeah, maybe that's best. We need some space to figure out our lives without constant input." Margaret looked at her daughter, hoping for more of a defense, but Emily's eyes were filled with tears and confusion. She was caught between her husband and her mother, and Margaret refused to make her choose. The walk to the subway felt longer than usual. Margaret's mind raced through every interaction, every conversation, every piece of advice she had given over the past 5 years. Had she really been that overbearing? She had only wanted to help, to share the wisdom that came from her 58 years of living. When Margaret got home to her small apartment in Queens, she sat in her favorite chair by the window and let herself cry. The tears came not just from Derek's words, but from the fear that he might be right. Had she become that mother? The one who couldn't let go? The one who saw her daughter's life as an extension of her own? Her phone buzzed. A text from Emily. "I'm sorry about tonight. Derek is just stressed about the business." He didn't mean it, but Margaret knew Derek had meant every word. And perhaps there was truth in his anger, even if his delivery was cruel. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the evening, Derek's red face, Emily's tears, the way the word dramatic had been spat at her like an insult. She got up at 3 in the morning and made tea, sitting at her small kitchen table surrounded by photographs of Emily growing up. Every recital, every graduation, every milestone. What Margaret didn't know, as she sat there in the darkness of her apartment, was that Derek's startup, TechFlow Solutions, was not just expanding. It was hemorrhaging money. The loans he had taken weren't for growth. They were to cover massive losses from a failed product launch. The apartment he had mortgaged, the bank was already sending notices. And the business itself, the company Derek protected so fiercely from Margaret's interference, had a secret buried in its founding documents. A secret that Margaret had quietly orchestrated 3 years ago when Derek had desperately needed capital and every bank had turned him down. But that revelation was still days away, and Margaret, sipping her cold tea in the pre-dawn quiet. Had no idea that her son-in-law's words would soon taste like ash in his mouth. 3 days passed without a word from Emily. Margaret checked her phone obsessively, hoping for a call, a text, anything. The silence was worse than the confrontation. On Wednesday morning, Margaret was grading papers from her former students, something she still did as a volunteer at the local high school, when her phone finally rang. It was Emily. "Mom, can we talk?" "Of course, sweetheart." They met at their usual spot, a small coffee shop in Park Slope, halfway between their apartments. Emily looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Derek wants me to stop talking to you for a while." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "What?" "He says you're too involved in our marriage. He thinks we need to establish independence, make our own decisions without your influence." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. "And what do you think, Emily?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know, Mom. I love him. He's my husband. But you're my mother. I feel like I'm being torn in half. This isn't about choosing sides, honey. This is about him isolating you." "See? That's exactly what Derek said you'd say. He told me you'd make him the villain, that you'd use your drama training to manipulate the situation." Margaret sat back, stunned. Derek had prepared for this conversation, scripted Emily's responses before she even walked in. "Emily, I need you to listen carefully. I'm not trying to control your life. I never have been. But I'm worried about you. These loans Derek is taking, the way he's acting, something isn't right. You don't understand business, Mom. Derek knows what he's doing." "Does he?" "Because from what you told me, he mortgaged your home without properly discussing it with you first. That's not how partnerships work in business or marriage." Emily stood up abruptly. "I knew this was a mistake. Derek was right. You can't help yourself. Wait, please." But Emily was already walking toward the door. She paused, turned back. "I need space, Mom. I'll call you when I'm ready." Margaret watched her daughter disappear into the crowded Brooklyn street. The coffee shop suddenly felt suffocating. Other patrons chatted and laughed, oblivious to the fact that Margaret's world was crumbling. That evening, Margaret received an email. It was from her financial advisor, Robert Chen, her late husband's younger brother. The subject line read, "Urgent, TechFlow Solutions status." Margaret opened it with shaking hands. Robert had been keeping an eye on Derek's company, as she had requested 3 years ago when she made her investment. The email contained quarterly reports, financial statements, and a summary that made Margaret's blood run cold. TechFlow Solutions was on the verge of bankruptcy. Derek had been hiding the losses from Emily, taking predatory loans from questionable sources, and according to Robert's investigation, he was now attempting to sell the company to a venture capital firm for pennies on the dollar, a sale that would leave Emily with nothing but debt. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing. Derek's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't trying to establish independence. He was trying to hide a disaster. Margaret spent the next morning on the phone with Robert, going through every document, every clause, every signature. The picture became clearer and more disturbing with each revelation. 3 years ago, when Derek's startup was just an idea and he couldn't secure funding anywhere, Margaret had stepped in. She had liquidated part of her retirement savings, money her late husband had left her, and invested $75,000 into TechFlow Solutions. But she hadn't done it blindly. Robert had drafted the paperwork. Margaret owned 40% of the company. Derek had been so desperate for capital that he had signed without fully reading the terms. He probably thought a retired drama teacher wouldn't understand business structures, that she'd be a silent partner who'd never ask questions. He had been wrong. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Margaret stood on the steps of TechFlow Solutions' small office in Manhattan. Emily had just arrived for what looked like an emergency meeting, based on the number of expensive cars parked outside. "I'm here for the shareholders' meeting," Margaret said calmly. Emily's face went pale. "What shareholders' meeting?" "The one Derek called this morning. Didn't he tell you?" Before Emily could answer, Derek appeared at the door. His confident expression faltered when he saw Margaret. Margaret, this is a business meeting. You need to leave. I'm a 40% shareholder, Derek. I have every right to be here. The color drained from Derek's face. Behind him, two men in suits emerged, the venture capital investors ready to buy his failing company. What is she talking about? Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were the original investment documents, all bearing Derek's signature. 3 years ago, your husband needed money to start his company. I gave him $75,000. In exchange, I received 40% ownership. He never told you, did he? Emily looked at Derek, whose jaw was clenched tight. You took money from my mother? After everything you said about her interfering? It was a business transaction, Derek said defensively. A business transaction you hid from your wife, Margaret added. Just like you hid the fact that you're trying to sell this company for $300,000 when it's drowning in $800,000 of debt. A sale that would destroy Emily financially. One of the investors cleared his throat. Mr. Morrison, is this true? You didn't disclose all shareholders? Derek's facade crumbled. The confident entrepreneur disappeared, replaced by a desperate man whose lies were unraveling in real time. Emily, I can explain. But Emily was staring at Margaret with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else. Recognition. Her mother hadn't been dramatic or controlling. She had been protecting her all along. Margaret turned to the investors. Gentlemen, as majority stakeholder when combined with my daughter's marital interest in this company, I'm rejecting this sale. We'll be restructuring TechFlow Solutions with proper oversight and transparency. Derek's world was collapsing, and this time, there was no one else to blame. The investors left within minutes, their interest in TechFlow Solutions evaporating once they understood the true complexity of the ownership structure. Derek stood in the doorway of his office, speechless, as Margaret and Emily stepped inside. The office was smaller than Margaret had imagined. Motivational posters lined the walls, but they felt hollow now, like props in a performance that had finally ended. How long have you known? Emily asked her mother, her voice steadier than before. About the investment? Since the beginning. About the financial troubles? Robert alerted me 2 weeks ago. I've been investigating ever since. Derek finally found his voice. You had no right to spy on my company. Margaret turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. I had every right. I'm an investor, and more importantly, I'm Emily's mother. When I saw you isolating her, hiding information, and preparing to make a decision that would financially ruin my daughter, I acted. Emily sat down in one of the office chairs, processing everything. So when you questioned the expansion at dinner, you already knew the company was failing? I knew enough to be concerned. I wanted to give you a chance to tell me yourself, to involve Emily in the decision-making. Instead, Derek chose to attack me and push me away. Derek ran his hands through his hair, the fight draining out of him. I was trying to fix it before anyone found out. The product launch failed. We lost our biggest client. I thought I could turn it around. By taking predatory loans? By mortgaging the home you share with my daughter without her full knowledge? That's not fixing things, Derek. That's digging a deeper hole. Emily looked at her husband with eyes that no longer held the same trust. You called my mom dramatic. You made me feel guilty for talking to her. But she was right about everything, wasn't she? Derek couldn't meet her gaze. I'm sorry. I was ashamed. I didn't want to admit I was failing. Failing isn't the problem, Margaret said quietly. Lying is. Isolating Emily is. Blaming others for your mistakes is. The room fell silent. Outside, the Manhattan afternoon traffic hummed, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in this modest office. What happens now? Emily finally asked. Margaret pulled out another document from her folder. I spoke with Robert this morning. We have options. We can bring in proper financial management, restructure the debt, and possibly save the company. But it requires transparency, accountability, and Derek stepping back from solo decision-making. You want to take over my company, Derek said bitterly. No, I want to save my daughter from your pride. There's a difference. Emily stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. When she turned back, There was a new strength in her posture. Derek, I love you, but I can't be in a marriage where I'm kept in the dark, where my mother is vilified for caring about me, where our financial future is gambled without my knowledge. Emily, please, I need time, and you need to decide if you want to save this marriage as much as you wanted to save your ego. Margaret watched her daughter walk out of the office with her head held high and felt a bittersweet pride wash over her. 18 months later, Margaret stood in the newly renovated office of TechFlow Solutions, now relocated to a bright space in Brooklyn with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River. The autumn sun streamed through the glass, warming her face. The company had survived. Barely, but it had survived. With proper financial oversight from Robert and a complete restructuring of the business model, TechFlow had pivoted from their failed product to consulting services, leveraging Derek's technical knowledge in a more sustainable way. The predatory loans had been consolidated and were being paid down methodically. The apartment mortgage had been refinanced with better terms. But the real transformation hadn't been in the business. It had been in the people. Mom, they're ready for you. Emily appeared in the doorway, wearing a sharp business suit. She had joined TechFlow 6 months ago as Chief Operating Officer, bringing organizational skills and financial literacy that the company had desperately needed. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a confidence Margaret hadn't seen in years. Margaret followed her daughter into the conference room where Derek sat with their small team of 5 employees. When Derek saw Margaret, he stood up. Margaret, thank you for coming. The formality between them had softened over the months, though it would never be the easy warmth Margaret had once hoped for with her son-in-law. Some bridges, once burned, could only be rebuilt, never restored to their original form. I wanted you to see this, Derek said, sliding a document across the table. We just secured our first major contract. It's enough to put us solidly in the black for the year. Margaret looked at the contract, then at Emily, who was smiling with genuine pride. That's wonderful. You've all worked incredibly hard. We couldn't have done it without your investment, Derek continued, and his voice carried a humility that hadn't been there before. Not just the money, the accountability, the structure. I was drowning and too proud to admit it. Pride can be expensive, Margaret said gently. After the meeting, Margaret and Emily walked along the waterfront, the October breeze carrying the scent of the river. They stopped at a bench overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge. How are things? Margaret asked. Really? Emily was quiet for a moment. We're in counseling. It's hard. Some days I'm angry all over again about the lies. But Derek is trying. Actually trying, not just performing. And you? Are you happy? I'm building something, Mom. The company, yes, but also myself. I forgot who I was for a while, trying to be the wife Derek wanted, trying to prove you wrong about your concerns. I lost myself in the process. Margaret took her daughter's hand. You were never lost, sweetheart. Just temporarily off course. Emily squeezed back. Thank you for not letting go. Even when I pushed you away. That's what mothers do. We hold on even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. They sat in comfortable silence, watching boats drift past on the river. Margaret thought about that Sunday dinner 18 months ago. Derek's angry words. The fear that she had lost her daughter forever. Your dramatic mom ruins everything, he had said. But sometimes, Margaret thought with a quiet smile, drama was exactly what was needed. Not the theatrical kind, but the kind that demanded truth, that refused to let injustice hide in silence, that loved fiercely enough to risk being called difficult. As the sun began to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and laughed. Derek wants to know if you'd come to dinner next Sunday. He's attempting to make pot roast. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Attempting? His words, not mine. Tell him I'll be there. And I'll bring dessert. As they walked back toward the subway, Margaret realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't silence or space. Sometimes it's the courage to speak up, to stand firm, to be called dramatic when being quiet would be easier. Because love isn't always comfortable. but it should always be honest. If the story touched your heart, if you've ever been misunderstood for protecting someone you love, take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing up for what's right is never dramatic. It's just love. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, family, and the strength it takes to do the right thing even when you're standing alone. Drop a comment below telling us about a time you had to stand firm for someone you cared about, or suggest themes you'd like us to explore in future videos. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your support means everything, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to stay silent. See you in the next story.